Good morning and a really warm welcome to this podcast. David Marshall from the Conscious Creation Academy. Today's podcast is slightly longer because it's a session from Unknown Reality, Volume 2, and it needs to be read in completion. So it's about 3 or 4 pages out of the book. It's session 727, and it's entitled Reincarnation and Counterparts, the Past Seen Through the Mosaics of Consciousness. In your terms, the land changes through the ages. Mountains and islands arise, then disappear to re-emerge in new form. The oceans rise and fall, and in some cases the floor of the ocean becomes the surface of the planet, only to be covered again by water. Yet through all of these changes the earth retains a landscape, and at any given time the features of the land are quite dependable and permanent enough for your purposes. So the islands that I spoke about in our last session rose up from beneath the sea. Even as the dialogue of those islands took place, the islands themselves were changing. In somewhat the same way the psyche sends up counterparts of itself, each with different features or characteristics. As the physical properties of the earth distribute themselves in a certain fashion, given about the surface of the planet, so do the properties of the earth-tuned psyches distribute themselves. As all physical matter is connected in any particular time or era, so the individual consciousness of each being is also connected with every other. This applies to all consciousness as you understand that term. A mountain is composed of many layers of rock that serve, as you think of it, as its foundation. The top of the mountain represents the present to you, and the tiers of rock beneath stand for the past. The mountain itself is not any one of these rock layers that seemingly compose it, however. There is a relationship between the mountain and those strata, but the term mountain is one that you have applied. In greater terms, the mountain and all of its components exist all at once, of course. You can examine the various levels of rock structure. Geologists will, when, in terms of time, certain sedimentary deposits formed. The rock themselves still exist in the geologist's present time, or they could not take such an examination. The mountain would not be a mountain without that foundation. Again, it is not any one of those rock layers. Now, in somewhat the same manner, the self, as you know it, is the mountain, and the rock layers forming it are past lives. You're not any one of those past selves, even though they are part of the history of your being. They are themselves in their own space and their own time. They exist simultaneously with your own life, even as the strata of the rock exists simultaneously with the mountain. Your present existence, however, is highly related to those other levels of selfhood. Now, what happens at the top of the mountain affects all that goes on below, and so everything that you do affects every other realm of selfhood, and there is an interchange that occurs constantly. Physical conditions may be quite different in the valley and the foothills of the mountain as at its top. The very climate and the vegetation may vary considerably, and yet all life and vegetation within the area are interrelated. Each layer of life that composes the mountain is equally valid and important, and each concentrates upon its own reality at its own level. Like the mountain, therefore, you have a history in terms of the present that is yours, and yet not yours. It doesn't control you, for you alter it with each thought and each action, even as the motion at the mountain's top affects its base. The layers at the bottom, however, are also constantly changing, so that the whole area is a gestalt of relatedness. In the physical world, islands, valleys, plateaus, continents, and oceans all have their place, and serve to form the physical basis of your reality. Each blade of grass helps form the life of the earth. So each consciousness, however minute, is indispensable in its place and time. Each flower on a hillside looks out with its own unique vision of the world, and each consciousness does the same thing, fulfilling a position impossible for any other consciousness to fulfill. In terms of time only, there is an archaeological meaning that is hidden within your own nature. To discover it, you must look down through the levels of your own being, there to find the layers of selfhood that in your world represent the past history of yourself from which you emerged. There are not only those selves psychically, however, any more than there are your mothers or your fathers in physical terms. You are as different, then, from your parents as you are from those reincarnational selves, though you share certain backgrounds and characteristics. It is easy for you to see how you affect your parents in your lifetime, though they are older than you. In the same way, however, you affect your reincarnational family. When it rains, water rushes in exuberant gushes down the side of the mountain, bringing life and vitality to all of its parts, and in somewhat the same way your own experiences flow down into the cracks and the crevices of all other times and centuries that compose your present lifetime. I have a surprise for you, however, for I've been speaking of you as if you were at the top of the mountain, for it certainly seems that you are at the top, so to speak. Instead, your vantage point and your focus is such that you cannot turn your head to look higher. Perhaps you are like a fine sunny cliff on the side of a mountain, jutting out, looking down on the valley below, not realizing that the mountain itself up and beyond you. You are then in the position of many other levels beneath that also think of themselves as the top of the mountain, looking only downward. You are convinced then that you cannot see the future, and this means, in terms of our analogy at least, that you cannot look upwards beyond your own time. While that is the case, you will always think of reincarnation as occurring in the past. Think instead of the strata of being, each simultaneously occurring. Physically, the human fetus bears the memory of its past. In your terms, it travels through the stages of evolution before attaining its human form. It attains that form, however, because it responds to a future time, a future self, not as yet physically created. The fetus itself, before its conception, responds to a self not yet physically apparent, and the future, in those terms, draws new life from the past. A reality of selfhood, an idea not yet materialized in the unformed future, reaches down into the past and brings that future into realization. The cells are imprinted with physical information in the terms of time and space, but those data came from the reality in which time and space are formed. The knowledge of probabilities brings forth present time and reality. Voices speak through the genes and the chromosomes that connect the future and the past in a balance that you call the present moment. The history of the private psyche and the mass experience of the species again resides within each individual. The archaeology of the past and the future alike is alive within the layers of consciousness that compose your being.